One man destroyed the entire Sith Order, every last one of them. And then he rebuilt it from scratch with a single rule that would take 1,000 years to detonate. The Jedi never saw it coming. The Republic never saw it coming. Nobody did, because nobody was looking for one man and a child hiding in the shadows while an empire slowly rotted from the inside out. That is the dynasty of Darth Bane. Not a war, not an army, a plan. The longest, darkest, most patient plan in the history of the galaxy. And it started with a boy who had absolutely nothing. No family that wanted him. No future worth imagining. No name anyone would remember. Just debt and darkness, and a rage so deep it had nowhere to go. Until the Force found it. Until the Force found him. And when it did, everything changed. Not just for him. For every living thing in the galaxy, for the next 1,000 years. This is the entire Darth Bane dynasty. From a cortosis mine at the edge of nowhere, to the throne room of a galactic empire. And the most terrifying part is how simple the idea was. 2 Sith, always 2. Never more, never less. 1 master to hold the power. 1 apprentice to crave it. That is all it took to bring the Republic to its knees. That is all it took to destroy the Jedi Order. 1 rule, 1,000 years. And a boy named Dessel, who had every reason to die, forgotten in the dark. Apatros was not the kind of place that inspired greatness. It was a company world owned and operated by the Outer Rim Oreworks Company, which extracted cortosis ore from beneath its surface and shipped it off to be processed and used in alloys throughout the galaxy. Cortosis was valuable precisely because of one remarkable property. It could short-circuit a lightsaber blade on contact. The irony that the boy who would one day reshape the Sith Order grew up mining the one material capable of resisting a lightsaber is the kind of detail history seems to enjoy. But the miners of Apatros did not think about irony. They thought about their debts. The company controlled everything on Apatros: the housing, the food, the equipment, the medical care. Even the cantina where men drank away the small amount of credits, the company allowed them to keep after deducting everything else. Every miner arrived already behind. The cost of transport to Apatros, the cost of their gear, the cost of their first month of housing, all of it went on a tab that the company held, and the wages the company paid were carefully calculated to ensure that tab never quite reached zero. It was not slavery in any legal sense. It was something more insidious than that. It was a system designed to give men just enough hope that they kept working, just enough scrip to buy a drink at the end of the day, while ensuring they could never actually leave. Most men who went to Apatros died on Apatros, not from violence or dramatic accident. Though those happened too, they died from the slow accumulation of years spent underground, breathing rock dust, breaking their bodies against walls of ore, watching the number on their debt ledger stay stubbornly fixed no matter how hard they worked. Into this world, a boy was born. His mother died in childbirth. That fact alone shaped everything that came after. His father, a miner named Hurst, had loved his wife in the way that broken men love things, desperately, and without knowing how to show it until it was gone. When she died bringing the boy into the world, something in Hurst died with her. What was left behind was anger, Not the clean, burning kind of anger that motivates a man to change his circumstances. The cold, festering kind that needs somewhere to go and settles on whatever is closest. The boy was closest. The boy was named Dessel, though that name meant nothing to anyone on Apatros except as something to shout when the work was not going fast enough. Hurst never called him son. He was the boy, or sometimes worse. What Hurst communicated most clearly through every interaction was the central fact of his worldview, that Dessel's very existence was a theft, that the boy had stolen his mother's life and owed a debt for it that could never be repaid. Think about what it means to grow up inside that belief. To be told in 1,000 different ways, every single day, that your existence itself is a crime. Most children in that situation collapse inward. They become small, apologetic, invisible. Dessel did not. Whatever force moved through the universe and connected all living things to each other had plans for Dessel that had nothing to do with becoming small. He was physically powerful even as a young man, stronger than boys his age and stronger than many of the grown miners around him. He was also ferociously intelligent, though there was no school on Apatros to cultivate that intelligence, and no one around him who recognized it for what it was. What his intelligence looked like from the outside, especially to Hurst, was defiance. Dessel did not accept the premises of his world. He questioned the debt system. He watched the company foremen and understood what they were doing. He saw the trap and hated it with a clarity that made the other miners uncomfortable, because the other miners had long since made their peace with the trap, and Dessel's refusal to do the same was a reminder of what they had given up. The one relationship in Dessel's early life that approached something like genuine warmth was with Groshik, a Neimoidian who ran the company Cantina. Groshik was not a sentimental creature. The Neimoidians were not known for sentimentality, but he was perceptive, and he saw something in Dessel that the boy's own father had refused to see. He gave him work behind the bar. He gave him small kindnesses, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention from the company overseers, just the consistent experience of being treated as though he mattered. It was not enough to offset everything else, but it was enough to keep something alive in Dessel that might otherwise have died. Groshik was also perceptive in another way. He noticed things about Dessel that Dessel himself did not have a name for yet. Moments when things happened around the boy that did not have ordinary explanations. A glass that slid across the bar without being touched. A confrontation between Dessel and a group of older miners that ended with the older men backing down despite having every physical advantage, backing down as though some pressure they could not see or identify had pushed them away. Groshik said nothing about these moments. He filed them away and watched. Hurst died when Dessel was a teenager. A mining accident. The kind that was quietly common on Apatros despite what the company's safety records claimed. Cave-ins, gas pockets, equipment failures that the company knew about and had not repaired because the cost of repairs exceeded the cost of losing a miner. When Hurst died, Dessel felt almost nothing, and then felt something much worse than grief, which was relief, and then felt ashamed of the relief. That particular tangle of emotions is the kind of thing that either destroys a person or hardens them in ways that are impossible to undo. It hardened Dessel. He inherited his father's debt, along with nothing else. The company was very clear that debts transferred within families. And so, at an age when many young men in the Republic were beginning their educations or their careers, Dessel was underground with a mining tool in his hands, chipping cortosis out of a rock face, watching his debt grow at a rate that his wages could never quite match, and understanding with absolute clarity that if he did not find a way out, Apatros would take everything from him the way it had taken everything from every man who had ever worked there. The way out came in the ugliest possible form. There was a sabak game. Sabak was the one real recreation on Apatros, the one thing the company could not entirely control, the one space where a miner could theoretically change his financial situation in a single night if the cards fell right and the other players were worse than he was. Dessel was good at sabak, not because he cheated, though cheating was common enough in those games. He was good because he watched people. He understood what they revealed about themselves when they were trying not to reveal anything. He read the tension in a man's shoulders when he had a good hand, and the particular quality of stillness that meant a man was trying to project confidence he did not feel. On the night that changed everything, there was a Republic soldier at the table. Off-duty, drinking, in the cantina, on Apatros, for reasons that were his own business. The soldier was not a good sabak player. He was an arrogant sabak player, which is a different thing entirely. And when the game turned against him and the credits began flowing toward Dessel's side of the table, the soldier decided that the easiest solution was to cheat. He was not subtle about it. Dessel caught it immediately. What happened next is the moment where everything changed, because what happened was not a fight in any ordinary sense. Dessel reached across the table to take back what was his. The soldier grabbed his wrist, and something moved through Dessel that he had no word for yet. Something that flooded up from a place he had never consciously accessed. And the soldier went over backward, not from being shoved, from something else entirely. From a force that came from Dessel's anger and the soldier's grip on his wrist, and some invisible connection between the two that neither of them could explain. The soldier hit his head on the corner of the table on the way down. He did not get up. Dessel stood there looking at what he had done and understood immediately that on Apatros, in this particular situation, with a dead Republic soldier and company overseers who would love nothing more than an excuse to wipe his debt off the books by handing him to Republic authorities, he had exactly one option. He ran. Groshik helped him. The old Nemoidian moved quickly and quietly, pulling in favors and moving credits and arranging things in ways that Dessel did not ask about, and Groshik did not explain. A transport, false documentation, a way off Apatros that technically did not exist and therefore could not be traced. As Dessel left the planet that had been his entire world, he felt something new. Not freedom exactly. Freedom would have felt lighter than this. What he felt was more like the moment before a thunderstorm, the air pressure changing. The sky not yet broken, but the understanding already present that something enormous is about to happen. He did not know what he was moving toward. He knew only what he was leaving behind. The debt, the dark tunnels, the memory of a father who had taught him, without ever intending to, that the universe owed nothing to anyone, and that the only way to survive was to be stronger than everything trying to crush you. He joined the Sith army. This was not a spiritual decision or an ideological one. It was a practical one. The Sith were at war with the Republic, and the Sith army needed bodies, and they were not asking too many questions about the past histories of the men who showed up willing to fight. Dessel was large, strong, hardened by years of physical labor, and utterly without fear. in the way that men who have already lost everything become without fear. He was given a uniform and a weapon and a unit and sent to the front. What no one in that Sith army unit expected was what Dessel was about to become as a soldier. He was not just capable, he was exceptional in a way that had nothing to do with training or technique, and everything to do with whatever was moving through him that he still had no name for. In battle, he seemed to sense things before they happened. He moved through firefights with an instinct that veteran soldiers twice his age did not possess. He made decisions in fractions of seconds that turned out to be right, when every logical calculation would have suggested a different choice. And he was ferocious. The anger that had nowhere to go on Apatros, the years of compressed fury and frustrated intelligence, and the specific violence of being hated by the one person who was supposed to love you, all of that found an outlet in battle that it had never found anywhere else. The other men in his unit noticed. His commanders noticed. He rose through the ranks with a speed that made people uncomfortable, the way extraordinary competence always makes ordinary competence uncomfortable. But it was not until a specific engagement, a battle on a world that seemed utterly unremarkable from any strategic standpoint, that Dessel's true nature became undeniable. The Republic forces had caught his unit in a trap. Pinned down, outflanked. The kind of situation where the only rational response is to hold position and wait to be destroyed or to surrender and hope for mercy. Dessel did neither. What he did instead is difficult to describe in purely physical terms, because it was not purely physical. He moved through that battlefield in a way that seemed to bend the reality around him. Men fell before he reached them. Objects moved. The trajectory of blaster bolts seemed to curve away from him, as though the air itself was being pushed aside. His unit, which should have been annihilated, survived. And they survived entirely because of one man who appeared, in those moments of combat, to be operating on a completely different level from anything any of them had ever witnessed. A Sith Lord was watching. Lord Copex was not the kind of Sith who lingered near frontline engagements for sentiment. He was there because intelligence had suggested the battle might be significant, and because Copex had learned long ago to trust the instinct that told him when something worth seeing was about to happen. He saw Dessel on that battlefield, and he understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a talented soldier, not an exceptional fighter, a force user, untrained, unrefined, operating entirely on raw instinct, which made what he was doing all the more remarkable. A trained force user fights with intention. An untrained one fights with something closer to the force itself, unfiltered by technique, guided only by the dark current that flows through every living thing and that, in some living things, flows harder and hotter and stronger than anything ordinary. Copex went to his superiors. The bureaucracy of the Sith Brotherhood of Darkness moved slowly, even in wartime, but it moved. Dessel was pulled from his unit, given new orders, and shipped to Korriban, to the Sith Academy, to the place where people like him were taken and shaped into something the Sith could use. Music. Korriban is a world that understands darkness the way Apatros understood death. It is baked into the stone, into the air, into the red soil of the Valley of the Dark Lords where ancient Sith rulers have been entombed for millennia. The dark side of the Force is not an abstract concept on Korriban. It is a presence. You can feel it when you step off your transport, a weight that is not quite gravity pressing down on something beneath your skin. Korriban teaches you immediately that you are small, and that everything around you is old and terrible and powerful in ways you do not yet understand. For most people, that feeling would be enough to make them want to leave on the next ship out. For Dessel, arriving at the Sith Academy with nothing but the name the army had given him and the dark fury that had been building inside him his entire life, Korriban felt like something he had always been moving toward without knowing it. The Sith Academy at Korriban was not a school in any comfortable sense of that word. It was a pressure chamber. The philosophy behind it was simple and brutal. Take a group of force-sensitive individuals, pit them against each other in every possible way, allow the strongest to thrive and the weakest to die or be discarded, and what emerges from the process is a cohort of Sith who have been proven through survival rather than merely tested through examination. There were masters at the academy. Lord Cordis ran it. A Sith of considerable vanity and considerable political skill, more comfortable in the halls of power than on a battlefield. Lord Cassian was there as the Academy's blade master, responsible for lightsaber instruction, and Cassian was the real thing. A Twi'lek who had mastered all 7 forms of lightsaber combat and could switch between them mid-duel with a fluidity that made watching him fight feel like watching water move. The instructors did not protect the students from each other. That would have defeated the purpose. Rivalries were encouraged. Conflicts were permitted to escalate. A student who could not navigate the social warfare of the Academy would not survive the galaxy beyond it. Dessel arrived using a false name, the name the army had assigned him. But names matter on Korriban, and this one did not fit him the way it should. What he came to be called during those academy years was Bane. It was not assigned. It was not given as an honor. It was something that accumulated around him the way that certain things accumulate around certain people. A word that the other students started using to describe what it felt like to be near him on a bad day, to be in his path when the anger was close to the surface. And eventually, the word just stuck. Later, it would become his Sith title, the name by which history would remember him. But at the Academy, it was just a name that seemed to fit. The other students at the Academy were extraordinary in their own rights. Force users do not end up at a Sith training facility by being mediocre, but even within that population, one student stood out as Bane's primary rival. Sirak was a Zabrak, one of the horned humanoids known for their resilience and their capacity for endurance. He was also, by a considerable margin, the most physically gifted fighter at the Academy. His force abilities were raw and powerful. His lightsaber technique was aggressive and precise. And he had the particular quality of self-belief that makes dangerous people more dangerous, the absolute conviction that he was the strongest person in any room he entered, and that anyone who seemed to threaten that status needed to be dealt with immediately. When Bane arrived and began moving through the Academy ranks with the same relentless momentum he had shown as a soldier, Sirak noticed. And Sirak decided, in the particular way that powerful people decide these things, that Bane needed to be stopped. The confrontation between them, when it came, was humiliating in a way that Bane had not experienced since childhood. Not physically humiliating, though Sirak was technically the better duelist in that moment. It was what happened to Bane during the fight that was truly devastating. His connection to the Force, the thing that had carried him through every battle, every crisis, every impossible situation since the night in the cantina on Apatros, abandoned him. Not completely, but enough. He could feel it pulling back. becoming unreliable, flickering like a flame in a wind. And in the space where the force had been, where that hot, dark current should have been flowing freely, there was doubt. That was the root of it. Bane had spent his entire life surviving on fury and instinct, and a kind of defiant certainty that he could not be broken. But Korriban got underneath that certainty in ways that Apatros never had. The other students were his equals in ways the miners of Apatros never were. The masters were more powerful than anything he had faced before. And in that environment, for the first time, Bane began to doubt himself. Not consciously, not in any way he could identify and address, but the doubt was there, and the Force felt it. And the dark side is a channel that flows most freely when a user is absolutely certain of their own power and absolutely unconcerned with the possibility of failure. The loss to Sirak was followed by something worse, a pattern. Sirak had recognized the weakness and would return to it the way predators return to an injury. The other students aligned themselves, as they always do in such environments, with whoever seemed like the winner. Bane found himself increasingly isolated. His classes continued, his training continued, but the Force was quieter than it had been. And the quiet terrified him in a way that no enemy had ever managed to do. Because the Force was the one thing in his life that had been truly his. The one thing Hurst had not been able to touch, the one thing Apatros had not been able to exhaust. And now, surrounded by the greatest concentration of dark side power in the galaxy, he was losing his connection to it. He did not understand why. He only knew that something was wrong and that the wrong thing was inside him. He studied, not the curriculum of the academy, though he continued with that too. He went deeper. The Academy's library held texts that most students did not bother with. Ancient writings on Sith philosophy and history and the nature of the dark side itself. Bane read them with the same voracious intelligence that had always been his most underused asset. And in those texts, he began to find something. Not answers yet, not the complete picture, but fragments of something that felt like the truth in a way that the Academy's current teachings did not quite manage to feel. The Brotherhood of Darkness, the organization that ran the Academy and managed the Sith army and prosecuted the war against the Republic, was built on a principle that these ancient texts seemed to directly contradict. The Brotherhood believed in numbers. It believed that strength came from unity, from many Sith working together, from an army of dark side users operating under a common banner. Lord Khan, who led the Brotherhood, had abolished the traditional hierarchy of Sith titles. In the Brotherhood, everyone was a lord. Everyone was equal. Everyone contributed to the collective strength. And on the surface, looking at the military situation, this seemed to be working. The Brotherhood was holding its own against the Jedi and the Republic. But Bane read the ancient texts and felt, in the place where the Force lived in him, that something about this was wrong. That equality was not a Sith virtue. That the dark side did not flow toward committees and collectives. That power, real power, the kind the ancient Sith Lords had wielded before the Brotherhood diluted everything, came from something different. Music. The Valley of the Dark Lords is where Korriban keeps its dead. The tombs of ancient Sith rulers line the walls of that vast canyon carved into the rock face itself, monuments to power that lasted long enough to leave a mark on the world and then ended the way all power eventually ends. In the valley, the dark side is so thick you can breathe it. Most students at the academy did not go into the valley alone. The tombs were sealed, but the force was not sealed. And what lived in the force around those tombs was old and hungry, and not inclined to be gentle with anyone who wandered near without sufficient strength to hold their own. Bane went anyway. He went because there was nowhere else to go. He had failed in the Academy's terms. His connection to the Force was still unreliable. Sirac had made him a target, and the other students had made him an outcast. There was nothing left to do inside the Academy walls that mattered. So he went where the dark side was strongest, and he sat in it, and he waited to see what happened. What happened was the orbalisks. They are small creatures, parasitic, ancient, native to the burial chambers of Korriban, where they have fed on the dark side energies leaking from the tombs for thousands of years. They attach to a host, and they do not let go. The attachment is not metaphorical. Their shells are harder than most known materials, harder than most armor, harder than almost anything that a lightsaber could penetrate without destroying the host tissue beneath. Once attached, they feed, not on blood or cellular material. Though they do draw some sustenance from the host's body, what they primarily feed on is dark side energy. They drink the Force from whoever they are attached to, and in return, they secrete a substance that enters the bloodstream of the host. That substance is a stimulant, a very specific kind of stimulant. It amplifies aggression, it amplifies pain sensitivity, it amplifies the dark emotions that feed the dark side. It creates a permanent state in the host that is adjacent to rage. Not rage itself, but the conditions in which rage lives. The constant low hum of fury just beneath the surface. The hair-trigger emotional state. The sense that everything is an affront and that the appropriate response to everything is violence. For most beings, the orbalisks would be a death sentence. The pain of their attachment alone, the feeding, the constant biochemical interference with the host's nervous system would drive an ordinary person insane within days. But Bane was not an ordinary person, and more importantly, Bane had the Force. The dark side of the Force, which the orbalisks were constantly feeding on and amplifying, became a feedback loop. The orbalisks fed on his darkness and increased it. The increased darkness fed the Force connection that had been faltering. The Force connection, now reinvigorated, made him stronger in ways that had nothing to do with the doubt that had been diminishing him. The doubt had been a product of confusion, of not understanding what he was. The orbalisks, in their terrible way, had resolved the confusion. They had locked him into the dark side so completely that there was no longer any psychological space in which doubt could exist. He was what he was. What he was a Sith. And the dark side, which had been retreating from him, came back. It came back harder and darker and more powerful than it had ever been before. He covered with armor. He could not remove the orbalisks even if he had wanted to, which he did not. They were growing across his torso, his arms, his neck, a living carapace of shells that was also, effectively, the best armor in the known galaxy. And under that armor, under the shells, in the blood running through his veins that now carried the orbalisk secretions, he was something new, something the Academy had not made him, because the Academy's methods had been pointed in the wrong direction from the start. He was alone in the Valley of the Dark Lords, with time and the dark side and the collected writings of the ancient Sith. And he began to read more carefully than he had ever read anything before. That was where he found Revan's holocron. The discovery felt like the universe deciding that it was time for him to understand something important. The Jedi who had become a Sith Lord and then become something beyond either, whose complicated legacy was buried in texts and artifacts, scattered across a dozen worlds, had left behind a repository of knowledge that most Sith in the Brotherhood had never thought to look for. The Brotherhood was not interested in old knowledge. The Brotherhood was interested in winning its current war. Bane was interested in something else entirely. He was interested in the truth about what the Sith were supposed to be and why the current version of the Sith felt so fundamentally wrong to him. Revan's holocron began to explain it. The nature of the dark side is not what most Sith in the Brotherhood understood it to be. They used it as a tool, a source of power to be drawn upon and directed. They thought of the Force the way a craftsman thinks of a hammer, something external that you pick up and put down and apply to problems. But the ancient teachings in Revan's holocron described something different. The dark side is not external. It is not a tool. It is an expression. It flows from the interior of a being who has genuinely, completely, without reservation or apology, accepted what they are and what they want and what they are willing to do to get it. Every Sith Lord who had ever been truly great had understood this on some level. The Brotherhood had forgotten it, or perhaps had never known it. They talked about the dark side constantly. They practiced with it constantly, but they were performing the dark side rather than living it, which is the crucial difference between great power and the appearance of great power. The holocron made Bane understand why his Force connection had been failing him at the Academy. He had been surrounded by people doing their best to embody Sith principles, and on some level he had been trying to be like them, trying to fit the Academy's mold of what a Sith should look like. And that trying, that effort to conform, was itself the problem. The dark side does not flow toward people who are trying to be something. It flows toward people who simply are something, completely without self-consciousness or uncertainty, or the particular kind of internal division that comes from trying to match someone else's idea of what you should be. The rule of two was not born fully formed from Revan's holocron. Bane came to it through a process that took months in the valley, reading and thinking and sitting with the dark side and feeling, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The concept he arrived at was both simple and radical. The reason the Sith kept destroying themselves was numbers. Too many Sith meant too many power centers. Too many power centers meant too much internal conflict. Too much internal conflict meant that the Sith's attention was always partly turned inward, always partly occupied with managing the ambitions and treacheries and rivalries within their own order, which meant they could never bring their full strength to bear on the Republic or the Jedi. The Brotherhood of Darkness was the ultimate expression of this flaw. Thousands of Sith Lords, all of them calling themselves equal, all of them quietly competing, all of them burning energy on internal politics that should have been going into the war. And even if they won this war, what then? An empire of 1,000 Sith Lords, each one ambitious, each one trained in the dark side, each one believing they deserved power and willing to take it. That empire would tear itself apart before a generation had passed. The solution was terrible in its elegance. Two, always, exactly, two Sith, one master, and one apprentice. The master holds the power and carries the knowledge. The apprentice learns and grows and strives toward the day when they are strong enough to challenge and destroy the master and take the title for themselves. Then the former apprentice becomes the new master and takes their own apprentice, and the cycle continues. This ensures several things simultaneously. It ensures that the Sith's knowledge is always preserved, always being transferred to the next generation, never lost to a moment of collective destruction. It ensures that each successive Sith is better than the last, because the apprentice who destroys the master must be stronger than the master to do so, and that strength is the proving of their worthiness. It ensures that there is never enough concentration of Sith power for the Jedi to detect. 2 people can hide. 1,000 people cannot. And it ensures that the dark side is always focused, always directed by the specific will of one truly powerful individual, rather than diluted across a collective that pulls in 1,000 different directions at once. One to embody the power, one to crave it. Bane sat with this idea for a long time. He turned it over and examined it from every angle. The way a man examines a stone he suspects might be a gem, looking for the flaw that will tell him it is just a stone after all. He did not find the flaw. The more he examined it, the more certain he became that this was not just a better way to organize the Sith. This was the correct way. The only way that could actually succeed over the long span of time that it would take to bring the Republic down. Because Bane understood, in a way that Lord Khan and the Brotherhood never had, that the Republic could not be destroyed in a single war. The Republic was enormous and resilient and had the Jedi on its side. And the Jedi would not be destroyed in a single war either. The Sith's greatest weapon was not their military power. It was their willingness to think in centuries, to plant seeds that would take generations to grow, to be patient in ways that the Republic, which had to maintain public support and democratic accountability and all the other vulnerabilities of an open society, could never match. 2 Sith, hidden, patient, moving through the galaxy without anyone knowing they existed. Generation after generation after generation, each one building on what the previous ones had established. That was how you destroyed the Republic. Not with armies, with time. Music. He came back from the valley, changed. The students at the academy, who had watched Bane fall, could not quite account for what returned. He was physically different, though they could not see why, because the orbalisk shells were hidden under clothing and armor. But the quality of his presence had shifted. The doubt that Sirak had exploited was gone, not resolved through confidence, training, or philosophical acceptance. Gone in the way that something is gone when the condition that created it no longer exists. Bane had stopped trying to be what the Academy wanted him to be. He had stopped measuring himself against the Brotherhood's standards. He was something the Brotherhood did not have a category for. And the absence of that measurement meant the absence of the doubt that had come from failing the measurement. He dueled Sirak again. This time there was no comparison. This time, Bane moved through the fight with the particular quality of absolute certainty that the orbalisk secretions maintained in him at all times, a quality that is not quite calm but is something adjacent to it, the stillness at the center of a storm. Sirak lost. He did not lose gracefully, but Bane did not stay to enjoy his rehabilitation in the Academy's social hierarchy. He had bigger concerns. He had spent his months in the valley understanding what was wrong with the Sith. Now he needed to do something about it. And doing something about it meant engaging with a problem that was considerably more complicated than winning a duel with a Zabrak. It meant finding a way to destroy the Brotherhood of Darkness itself. Every Sith Lord in the Brotherhood, every member of the organization that had spent decades fighting the Republic and believed it was on the verge of victory, all of them needed to die, because all of them represented the old way, the wrong way, the way that would lead to failure and self-destruction no matter how the current war ended. Bane was not sentimental about this. He had never been sentimental about anything. The Brotherhood needed to die so that something better could be born. The question was how to make that happen without anyone understanding that it was happening, which was the kind of problem that Bane's particular combination of intelligence and dark side power was perfectly suited to solve. The key was Lord Khan. Khan was the leader of the Brotherhood of Darkness, the Sith Lord who had unified the various factions of the dark side community under a single banner and was prosecuting the war against the Republic with considerable tactical skill. He was not the most powerful Sith Lord in the Brotherhood. He was the most charismatic and the most politically clever, which were the qualities that mattered when your goal was to keep 1,000 ambitious dark side users pointed in the same direction rather than at each other. Bane had studied Khan the way he had studied everything at the Academy, carefully, looking for the structure beneath the surface, the actual mechanism under the performance. What he found was that Khan's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. He was terrified of being challenged, not physically, politically. Khan had built the Brotherhood on the principle of equality precisely because equality was the one principle that prevented any single Sith Lord from becoming strong enough to threaten his position. But that same fear of challenge meant that Khan was susceptible to flattery in a very particular way. Not the crude flattery of simple compliments, the flattery of having his ideas validated by someone he considered intelligent, of being told that his instincts were correct by someone whose judgment he respected. Bane understood this, and he began to use it. He approached Khan not as a rival or a threat, but as a student and an enthusiast. He raised questions about the war. He offered analysis that was genuinely useful. He made himself useful in ways that kept him in Khan's orbit, without triggering the wariness that Khan reserved for anyone who seemed to want something. And over time, with the patience that the dark side teaches, and that the minds of Apatros had made second nature to him, Bane began to plant ideas. Small ones at first, observations about Jedi tactics, thoughts about how the Brotherhood might respond to specific Republic strategies. Nothing that seemed to have an agenda behind it, just a sharp mind sharing its observations with the leader it served. And underneath all of that, the real work, because Bane had found something in the ancient texts that he had been very careful not to share with anyone else. A weapon, the most terrible weapon the ancient Sith had ever devised. Something so catastrophically destructive that the Sith who had originally created it had apparently been too frightened of their own invention to use it themselves. A Sith ritual of such power and such horror that performing it required the combined energy of every Sith Lord willing to participate. And the price of that participation was the utter annihilation of everyone involved. It was called the Thought Bomb. The Thought Bomb was not a bomb in any physical sense. It was a convergence, a ritual in which every Sith who participated channeled all of their dark side power into a single point of concentrated force energy, building it and building it until it could no longer be contained, and then releasing it. The release was not a blast or an explosion. It was something more like an implosion of the force itself. a violent tearing of the fabric that connected living things to the Force, localized to the area around the ritual site. Every Force user within range when the thought bomb detonated would have their Force essence, the actual living spiritual core of their being, ripped free from their body and trapped. Not destroyed, trapped. The thought bomb did not kill Force users in any ordinary sense. It captured them, their consciousness, their essence, their awareness. All of it would remain trapped in the device, in a state of perpetual agonized awareness, with no body and no hope of escape. It was, in its way, a fate considerably worse than death. The Sith, who had first developed it, had called it the ultimate weapon against the Jedi. Bane read the description of what it did to its own creators and understood something that those original architects apparently had not. The thought bomb did not distinguish between Sith and Jedi. It only distinguished between Force users and everyone else. The war had reached its crisis point at a world called Ruusan. The Brotherhood of Darkness had pulled its most significant forces there. The Republic's Army of Light, led by Lord Hoth. A Jedi of considerable age and stubbornness and skill had done the same. 7 battles had been fought at Ruusan. 7 separate engagements, each one brutal, each one inconclusive. The forces of light and dark grinding against each other on a forested world that was slowly being destroyed by the conflict being conducted across its surface. The 8th battle was coming, and everyone on both sides knew it would be the decisive one. Bane needed it to be decisive in a very specific way. He needed the thought bomb to go off at Ruusan. He needed it to take the Jedi and the Brotherhood of Darkness with it, leaving behind nothing but ash and the beginning of something new. He managed Khan toward this outcome with a patience and a precision that was itself a masterclass in manipulation. He raised the subject of the thought bomb obliquely as something he had found in the ancient texts that seemed interesting from a historical perspective. He let Khan discover it for himself, steering the conversation without appearing to steer anything. When Khan began to consider it seriously, Bane raised concerns that sounded like genuine caution but were actually precisely calibrated to make the idea more appealing. He questioned whether the Brotherhood was strong enough to execute the ritual. Khan, who could not bear the suggestion that the Brotherhood was anything less than supremely capable, became more convinced it should be attempted. He questioned whether the timing was right. Khan, whose entire leadership depended on his ability to identify the right moment for decisive action, became more attached to the idea of using it at Ruusan. Bane was not pushing Khan toward the thought bomb. He was arranging the environment so that Khan pushed himself there. By the time the decision was made, Khan believed it was his own idea, his own strategic insight, his own brilliance. He had no reason to suspect that the instrument of his destruction was standing beside him in plain sight, making encouraging sounds. Bane left the battlefield before the thought bomb detonated. He had arranged to be elsewhere. The explosion of dark side energy that ripped through Ruusan on that day was not visible from orbit, but it was visible in the Force. A sudden, terrible silence where there had been a symphony of dark and light energies, a gap in the fabric of the living Force where hundreds of powerful beings had existed moments before. The Jedi, who were not Force users, the ordinary soldiers, survived. The Jedi Masters and Knights who had been in range did not, though some survived on the outskirts of the blast. The Brotherhood of Darkness was gone. Every Sith Lord who had participated in the ritual was trapped in the thought bomb's terrible crystalline prison, their essences locked in perpetual agonized awareness. Every Sith Lord who had not participated had still been caught in the radius. The ancient Sith Order, the Brotherhood, the 1,000-year lineage of the dark side organized as an army, was over. One Sith remained. Bane walked through the aftermath of Ruusan the way a man walks through the place where his old life used to be. Not with regret, with purpose. He was the last Sith. He was the first Sith of the New Order. The rule of two had no meaning without a two. And finding the second was not something he could delay. The second had to be chosen correctly, had to be young enough to be shaped by his teachings rather than already formed by someone else's, had to be Force sensitive in a way that was genuine, not trained, the raw natural connection that the Force established in certain beings who had not yet learned to question or suppress it, had to be. In some way, he could not entirely articulate to himself, but that he trusted the Force to guide him toward the right person. He found her on the battlefield, in the aftermath of the thought bomb, among the confusion and the grief and the Jedi trying to find their dead and the Republic soldiers trying to make sense of what had happened. There was a small girl. She had come to Ruusan with a group of young refugees, children who had been swept up in the chaos of the war and had ended up on this world at the worst possible moment. Her name was Rain. She was young enough that she had not yet learned to be afraid of the dark side in the way that adults are taught to be afraid of it. She was old enough to have experienced real loss, the loss that teaches a person what the world is actually made of. And she was. When Bane stood near her and reached out through the Force, burning with potential in a way that he had only felt once before in his life, when he had first genuinely understood what was moving through him. She had it, the raw connection, the natural channel, the darkness that was not yet darkness, but was the seed of it, waiting for the right conditions to grow. He gave her a Sith name before she understood what it meant, Darth Zana. The name carried weight that she could not yet feel. The weight of what she was being made into, the weight of the role she would play in a plan that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Bane looked at this child and did not feel sentiment. Sentiment was not something the orbalisks permitted in any sustained form. What he felt was recognition. The recognition of a craftsman who has found the right material for what they are trying to build. He was the rule of two. She would complete it. And together, whether she understood it yet or not, they were the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen and would not recognize until it was far too late to stop. The rule of two was born on the ruins of everything the Sith had been. One master to hold the power. One apprentice to crave it. Always two. Never more, never less. And in the wreckage of Ruusan, under skies still thick with the aftermath of war, Darth Bane looked at his new apprentice and understood that the real work was only just beginning. The war was over. The long patience was starting. The Sith would vanish from the galaxy's knowledge completely. They would let the Republic and the Jedi believe that the Sith were gone, defeated, destroyed at Ruusan. Let them celebrate. Let them write the histories. Let them teach their children that the dark side had been extinguished forever, because in the shadows, in the secret places, in the careful transmission of knowledge from one master to one apprentice across generation after generation, the Sith would be building something. Something quiet, something patient, something that would take 1,000 years to be ready. And when it was finally ready, It would not look like an army. It would not announce itself with warships or battle flags. It would come from the inside, from within the Republic's own institutions, disguised as a public servant, speaking the language of democracy and justice, while dismantling both from the foundations up. Bane did not know the specific shape of what would eventually come. He did not know the name Palpatine or the word Empire. He only knew the principle, and the principle, carried faithfully forward by each generation, would eventually produce exactly what he had designed it to produce, not just the destruction of the Republic, the replacement of it, root and branch, institution and ideal, replaced with something that embodied the Sith philosophy at the most fundamental level, a galaxy ordered by strength, a galaxy where power was not pretended to flow from the consent of the governed, but acknowledged openly to flow from whoever was strong enough to hold it. That was the galaxy Bane wanted. That was the galaxy he began building on the day he walked away from Ruusan with a child's hand in his, and the Force moving through him darker and stronger than it had ever moved through anyone before. Music. The girl was not passive about what was happening to her. That was one of the first things Bane noticed about Xana that confirmed his choice. A passive child would have been the wrong choice. The rule of two was not designed to produce obedience. It was designed to produce strength. An apprentice who accepted everything without question, who deferred without resentment, who learned without ambition, would be useless to the plan. What the rule required was an apprentice who was learning with the specific goal of eventually surpassing the master, who carried inside them, even in the earliest days of their training, the seed of the ambition that would one day drive them to challenge and destroy their teacher. The master needed to know this was coming, needed to see it in the apprentice from the beginning, needed to be teaching someone who was actively, consciously, or not, preparing for the day they would no longer need to be taught. Bane looked at Xana on the battlefield of Ruusan and saw that. The way she looked at him was not the way a frightened child looks at an adult they are trusting with their safety. It was the way a young predator looks at an older one, measuring, processing, filing away information that might be useful later. She was 7 or 8 years old, and she already had that quality. It would take years to develop it fully. It would take the kind of training that had no equivalent in the galaxy, training that blended the dark side's philosophical tradition with the specific practical curriculum that Bane was going to design from scratch, because no curriculum that currently existed was adequate for what he was trying to produce. But the raw material was there. You cannot teach someone to have that quality. Either they are born with it, or they are not. Xana had it. He told her very little about what she was becoming in those first days. Not because he intended to deceive her about the nature of her new life, but because the truth was not something that language was quite capable of conveying to someone who had not yet experienced any of the things the truth was made of. He told her she was his apprentice. He told her she would be trained. He told her that what had happened at Ruusan was both an ending and a beginning. She listened with a seriousness that was itself a kind of proof of his assessment of her. She did not ask the questions children typically ask, the anxious questions about safety and comfort and familiarity. She asked a single question that Bane turned over in his mind for years afterward because of what it revealed about her. She asked whether she was going to be strong. He told her that was entirely up to her. She accepted this answer with a nod that suggested she had already decided the answer was yes. What Bane was carrying away from Ruusan was not only an apprentice, he was carrying the accumulated weight of everything the Sith had been, and the specific responsibility of transforming that weight into something useful. The ancient knowledge, the philosophical framework of the Rule of Two, the practical techniques of the dark side, the history of every Sith Lord going back to the exile from the Republic and the discovery of Korriban and the founding of the original Sith Empire, all of it had to be preserved, organized, and transmitted. The Brotherhood of Darkness had been casual with knowledge, in a way that drove Bane's contempt. They had treated ancient wisdom as decoration, background context for an organization that was primarily concerned with winning battles. Bane intended to treat it as the most precious thing in the galaxy, which it was. Knowledge was the continuity of the Sith. Knowledge was the thread that connected each generation to the last and the next. Without it, the Sith were just people with dark side abilities and bad intentions, which the galaxy had seen plenty of and which had never amounted to anything permanent. With it, properly maintained and properly transmitted, the Sith was something the galaxy had never actually seen yet. A dynasty, a lineage, a project operating across time in ways that the Republic's democratic institutions, with their fixed terms and election cycles and generational shifts in priority, could never match and could never defend against. He would build holocrons. The Sith holocron was the ideal vessel for this transmission. A device that stored not just information but something approaching the personality and perspective of its creator, allowing future generations to interact with the knowledge in a living way rather than simply reading static text. He had already begun designing the one he would eventually create, the record of his philosophy and his methods that would be available to his apprentices, to every Sith who came after him in the unbroken chain he was establishing. He wanted it to contain not just what he knew, but why he knew it. Not just the conclusions, but the reasoning. Because the Sith he was building toward, the ultimate expression of the Rule of Two, would need to understand the principle deeply enough to adapt it to circumstances that Bane could not foresee. The galaxy would change. The Republic would change. The Jedi would change. The Sith had to be flexible enough to change with it while remaining absolutely faithful to the core truth. Power flows from strength. Strength is proven by survival. Survival in the long term requires patience and intelligence, and the willingness to be invisible for as long as invisibility serves the goal. The Sith were going to be invisible for a very long time. Bane was at peace with that. As he left Ruasan with Zana, moving quietly and without announcement toward whatever came next, he felt the dark side moving through him with a clarity it had never quite had before. Not even in the Valley of the Dark Lords, not even in the first flush of the orbalisk bonding, had it felt quite like this. It felt like purpose. The dark side, for all its power, is ultimately an expression of will, of the absolute primacy of what a particular being wants, uncontaminated by sentiment or obligation, or the Jedi's insistence that the Force had its own intentions that individual users were supposed to subordinate themselves to. Bane wanted. He had always wanted, since the earliest days on Apatros, when wanting things and not being able to have them had been the central experience of his existence. But now the wanting had a shape, had a specific architecture, had a plan behind it that extended across more time than any individual life could contain. The wanting was no longer personal. It had transcended the personal. It was now the wanting of the Sith Order itself, compressed into one man and one girl, and the Rule of Two that connected them. That was power. Not the crude power of armies or the flashy power of force lightning. The power of a vision so clear and so patiently pursued that it became, inevitably, the future. Training Zana was not like anything Bane had experienced on Korriban. The Academy had been a machine. It took raw material and put it through a standardized process and produced a standardized output. Sith Lords who all more or less understood the same things and fought in more or less the same ways, and organized their relationship to the dark side along more or less the same lines. Bane had rejected that machine. He had rejected it philosophically at the deepest level, understood it as the central flaw of the Brotherhood of Darkness, the thing that had been diluting Sith power for generations by producing quantity over quality. Training Zana meant building something from scratch. No curriculum to follow, no rubric to grade against, no other instructors to share the burden or to second-guess his methods. Just one man and one child. And the dark side of the Force. And the question of what the dark side could produce when it was applied by someone who had thought very carefully about what they were trying to create. He began with the philosophy before the technique. This was deliberate. Most Sith training programs began with the practical, the Force abilities, the lightsaber forms, the combat techniques, and added the philosophical framework later as context for what the student was already learning to do. Bane reversed this because he understood something about the nature of the dark side that the Brotherhood had consistently failed to understand. The dark side does not respond to technique in isolation. It responds to the whole person. A being who has genuinely, completely internalized the Sith philosophy will find that the techniques follow naturally, emerge almost organically from the philosophical foundation, because the techniques are just the outward expression of what is already happening internally. A being who learns the techniques first and tries to graft the philosophy onto them later will always have a slightly artificial quality to their power, like someone who has memorized a language phonetically without understanding what the words mean. They can say the sentences, but they are not thinking in the language. Bane wanted Zana to think in the language, so he told her stories. Not the sanitized histories the Jedi taught in their archives, or even the officially sanctioned narratives the Brotherhood had circulated among its members. He told her the real stories, the unvarnished accounts of what the ancient Sith had actually done, what had actually driven them, what had actually made them powerful, and what had actually destroyed them. He told her about the original Sith species and the exiled Jedi who had conquered them and the civilization they had built together on Korriban. A civilization that proved the dark side was not inherently self-defeating if you were intelligent enough about how you organized it. He told her about Naga Sado and Marka Ragnos and Friedan Nad and Exar Kun, about what each of them had accomplished and where each of them had ultimately gone wrong. He was building in her a historical consciousness that most Sith Lords never developed, the ability to look at the entire arc of Sith history and extract from it the principles that were genuinely universal, as opposed to the ones that had simply worked for a particular lord in a particular era. He was teaching her to think like someone responsible for the long game, rather than just the immediate situation. She was an extraordinary student. Not because she absorbed information quickly, though she did. Not because she had a natural aptitude for dark side techniques, though that was obvious from very early on. What made Zana extraordinary as a student was the same quality that had made her choice so obvious to Bane on the battlefield of Ruusan. She questioned things. Not in the way that students question things when they are confused or resistant. In the way that genuinely intelligent people question things when they are trying to understand the underlying structure beneath the surface presentation. She would listen to something Bane told her about Sith philosophy and then, days later, come back with an objection or a counterexample that demonstrated she had been turning the idea over in her mind the whole time, testing it, looking for the places where it did not quite hold. Bane found this quality more encouraging than almost anything else about her. The rule of two required each generation to be better than the last. A student who accepted everything uncritically would not grow past the master. A student who questioned would. Her natural affinity with the Force expressed itself in a direction that Bane had not entirely anticipated, which itself told him something important about the nature of the rule of two. He had been a blunt instrument in many ways. His power was enormous, but it expressed itself primarily as force, as overwhelming dark side energy directed outward, as physical and force-based domination. He was the dark side as a hammer. Zana was something different. Her connection to the Force curved toward the subtle, toward the complex, toward the kind of power that operated on the mind and the will and the fabric of reality rather than simply battering against it. She had a natural gift for Sith sorcery, the ancient and genuinely terrifying branch of dark side knowledge that most modern Sith had essentially abandoned in favor of more immediately legible powers. Force lightning was impressive. You could see it. You could demonstrate it. Sith sorcery was harder to show off and harder to explain and considerably more dangerous to practice imprecisely, which was why most Sith masters did not bother teaching it. Bane was not interested in what was easy to teach. He was interested in what was most powerful. And Sith sorcery, in the hands of someone with a genuine natural affinity, for it was among the most powerful things the dark side could produce. She learned to reach into minds in ways that went beyond simple influence or interrogation. Sith sorcery, at its most advanced, allowed a practitioner to construct realities inside another being's consciousness, to rewrite their understanding of what was happening to them, to plant experiences that felt completely real and that could, if the sorcerer chose, drive the target permanently into a form of madness from which no healer could retrieve them. This was not combat technique in any conventional sense. It did not require proximity. It did not require a lightsaber or even a directed force push. It required the precise manipulation of the Force at a level of subtlety that only someone with Zana's natural inclination could manage without years of preliminary failures. She took to it the way some beings take to languages, absorbing the grammar and the vocabulary and the idiom simultaneously, rather than building up each layer separately. By the time she was 10 years old, she had already demonstrated abilities that most Sith Lords who lived their entire lives in the dark side never developed at all. Bane and Zana moved through the galaxy carefully in those early years. Carefully in the sense that they did not draw attention. Carefully in the sense that every movement was thought through, every contact managed, every interaction controlled. The Republic believed the Sith were extinct. This was perhaps the single most strategically valuable piece of misinformation in galactic history. And Bane had arranged it deliberately. The thought bomb at Ruusan had been so total, the destruction of the Brotherhood of Darkness so apparently complete, that the Republic and the Jedi had allowed themselves to accept the conclusion they desperately wanted to be true. The Sith are gone. The war is over. The galaxy is safe. In celebration of this conviction, they had even passed what they called the Ruusan Reformation, a sweeping reorganization of the Republic's military and governmental structures, premised entirely on the assumption that there was no longer any existential dark side threat to plan around. They stood down armies. They restructured the Jedi Order. They demilitarized in ways that would have been reckless even if the Sith had genuinely been extinct, and were catastrophically reckless given that they were not. Bane watched all of this and felt the satisfaction of a craftsman watching a trap spring exactly as designed. Every piece of the Ruusan Reformation was a gift. Every soldier stood down was an enemy that would not be fighting 1,000 years from now. Every institutional restructuring premised on Sith extinction was a vulnerability being built into the Republic's foundations. The galaxy was doing Bane's work for him. He only had to stay hidden and let it happen. Staying hidden required resources, and resources required movement. Bane had planned for this. In the period between his departure from the Academy and the events at Ruusan, he had accumulated funds and contacts and information in the careful way that a man who has always had to be resourceful manages these things. Not a vast network. Vast networks left traces. A few specific assets, carefully chosen, each one serving a specific function, and none of them knowing about the others. A false identity here. A financial arrangement there. A carefully maintained public persona that allowed him to operate in legitimate galactic commerce as needed without any connection to Darth Bane, who officially did not exist. Zannah learned this operational discipline the same way she learned everything else. By watching and asking and being given more responsibility as she demonstrated the judgment to handle it. They settled for periods on worlds that offered what they needed without requiring more interaction with the broader galaxy than was useful. Bane continued his studies. He was never finished learning. The Rule of Two demanded that each Sith Master be not just powerful but comprehensive, holding all the knowledge of the Order so that none of it could be lost to a single disaster. He collected texts, artifacts, holocrons, anything connected to the pre-Brotherhood Sith traditions that the Brotherhood itself had neglected or discarded. He was building a library, not a physical library, in any single location, because a physical library could be found and destroyed. A library carried in the minds of two Sith, augmented by carefully preserved physical records kept in locations known only to them. The knowledge of the ancient Sith was not going to be lost again. Bane would see to that personally. Music, the orbalisks were always there, under the armor, under the clothing, living on his skin and feeding on his darkness, and maintaining in his bloodstream that constant, low-grade flood of aggression and pain sensitivity that had become so ordinary to him, he could no longer remember with any precision what he had felt like before they attached. He had stopped thinking of them as a burden many years ago. They were a fact, the way the mines had been a fact, the way his father's hatred had been a fact, the way everything in his life that had seemed like a disadvantage had turned out to be, in some way, something he could use. The orbalisks made him stronger. The constant pain kept him honest. The aggression they maintained in him meant the dark side was always accessible, always at the surface, never something he had to work to reach. Most Sith Lords had to cultivate their connection to the dark side. They had to find things to be angry about, nurture grievances, remember old wounds, perform the emotional landscape that the dark side required. Bane just had to breathe. The orbalisks were performing that work for him constantly, which freed his mind for other things. But the orbalisks were also, and this was a fact he had been aware of from very early in the relationship, eventually going to kill him. Not soon, not before he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. But they were living things attached to a living host, and living things change over time. And the changes were not moving in a direction that was going to be sustainable indefinitely. The shells were growing, slowly, year by year, imperceptibly, in any given week. They were expanding their coverage across his body. There would come a point when the coverage was complete enough that they would begin to interfere with each other. And when that happened, the biochemical processes that sustained the relationship would destabilize in ways that would be catastrophic for the host. He had calculated this. He was not a being who avoided thinking about the unpleasant. He thought about the unpleasant with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else. Because the unpleasant that you had thought through carefully could be managed, and the unpleasant that you had refused to examine would kill you. The removal of the orbalisks was therefore not an emergency when it happened, but a planned event, in the sense that Bane had been thinking about how to accomplish it for years. The technical difficulty was extreme. The obelisk shells were essentially impenetrable by any ordinary means. Getting a blade or a tool between the shell and the skin without destroying the underlying tissue required a level of precision that went beyond most beings' abilities with conventional medical instruments. The orbalisks had woven themselves into his nervous system in ways that made surgical separation genuinely life-threatening. And even if the physical separation could be achieved, the withdrawal from the orbalisk secretions that had been flooding his system for years would be a biological crisis of unpredictable severity. His body had adapted to the constant chemical presence of those secretions. Without them, the adaptation itself would become a problem. The dark side abilities that the orbalisks had been amplifying would, at least temporarily, become unreliable as his system adjusted to functioning without the biochemical support that had become load-bearing. There was a healer on Ambria. The planet was not notable for much else. It was a world with a dark history, scarred by an ancient Sith battle that had left the dark side so concentrated in certain areas of its surface that ordinary people could feel the wrongness of it without being force-sensitive at all. But on that same world, precisely because of the dark side concentration, a healer named Caleb had established himself. Not a Jedi, not affiliated with any order or institution, just a man of extraordinary force sensitivity who had devoted his life to the kind of healing that required going deeper into the force than most healers were willing to go, because the conditions on Ambria attracted the kinds of patients whose problems required exactly that depth of engagement. Bane had known about Caleb for some time. He had filed the information and waited for the moment when it became relevant. That moment arrived. The removal of the orbalisks was something that existed at the very edge of what Caleb's abilities could manage. Bane came to him not as Darth Bane, because Darth Bane did not officially exist, but as a man with a severe medical problem who had heard that Caleb was the only person in this part of the galaxy capable of addressing it. Caleb was perceptive enough to understand that his patient was dangerous. Being perceptive enough to understand that, and then performing the procedure anyway, was either extraordinary courage or an exceptionally strong healer's conviction that his function was to heal regardless of who needed healing. Perhaps both. What the procedure involved, on a technical level, required the use of force lightning, not as a weapon, as a precisely calibrated tool. Applying it at specific points between the orbalisk shells and the skin beneath, disrupting the biochemical bonding that held them in place, without triggering the defensive response that would make the shells contract and cut off the blood supply to the tissue underneath. The lightning had to be exactly the right intensity and exactly the right duration, applied to exactly the right locations in exactly the right sequence. Too much and the host dies. Too little and the shells do not release. Getting it precisely right required a healer who understood both the anatomy of the attachment and the force mechanics of the disruption. With a depth that Caleb had spent years developing specifically because he had treated other, less extreme cases of orbalisk attachment, and had been preparing for the possibility of one like this. It nearly killed him anyway. Bane would not have characterized himself as someone who feared death. Death was a fact about existence that he had no particular emotional response to in the abstract. But in the actual experience of the orbalisk removal, in the hours during which the shells were being separated and the biochemical withdrawal was beginning, and his body was doing things that bodies do when their fundamental operating chemistry is being abruptly restructured, there were moments when the boundary between living and dying became thinner than he was comfortable with. Caleb worked with the focus of a man who understood that failure meant something worse than a patient dying on his table. It meant whatever this particular patient represented being unleashed on whoever had sent him here with revenge in mind. He did not know what his patient was. He knew the patient was something outside the categories he had available for thinking about people. He worked carefully, and he worked correctly, and Bane survived. What emerged from that procedure was different from what had gone into it, not weaker, though there was a period of weakness during recovery that Bane endured, with the particular ferocity of a being who found weakness intolerable and therefore moved through it as quickly as possible. Different in the sense that something that had been external was now internal. The orbalisk-enhanced fury, the constant biochemical amplification of his connection to the dark side, all of that was gone. What remained was everything that had been there underneath it, which turned out, after the recovery, to be more than he had perhaps given himself credit for. The raw force power that the orbalisks had been drinking from and amplifying was still his. The philosophical clarity he had developed in the valley and refined through years of practice and study was still his. What was different was the temperature of the dark side in him. Before the orbalisks, it had been like living inside a furnace. After their removal, it was something colder and in its way more controlled. A cold, dark energy rather than a hot one. He was not certain this was worse. Music. During these years, Xana was becoming something. The word becoming is the right one, because the process was not finished while Bane was alive to observe it, which was itself part of the design. An apprentice who finishes becoming something while still under the master's instruction has become what the master wanted them to be. And what the master wanted them to be is, necessarily, something slightly less than what the master is, because the master would not survive training an equal. The rule of two had a particular sophistication built into this dynamic that most people who thought about it in purely philosophical terms missed. The master needed to train the apprentice to be strong enough to one day destroy the master. But training someone to be capable of destroying you required a very precise kind of confidence in yourself. The confidence that you would see the attack coming and survive it, or the acceptance that if you did not see it coming, then you deserved to lose. Bane had both kinds of confidence. He watched Xana grow and felt not the anxiety of a teacher whose student is approaching their level, but the satisfaction of a craftsman watching the work approach completion. Her sorcery was extraordinary, beyond anything Bane could do himself, which was precisely what he had been cultivating. A Sith master should not train an apprentice to be their copy. They should train an apprentice to be the next step, the next evolution. the being who carries everything the Master was and adds something the Master could not achieve. Xana's sorcery was that addition. Her ability to reach into minds and unwrite reality from the inside out had developed into something that genuinely had no precedent in the post-Brotherhood era. She could look at a person and, given a few seconds of contact, understand the precise architecture of their fears, the specific vulnerabilities of their psychology, the exact pressure points that, if engaged correctly, would produce results that a blunt instrument of the Force could never produce. She did not need Force lightning to destroy someone. She needed understanding of what they were most afraid of, and then she needed to give it to them. There were threats during these years. The galaxy was not empty of dangers, and two Sith operating in secret were not immune to the kinds of complications that arose when you were hiding from an entire civilization while simultaneously trying to accumulate power within it. There were Jedi who got too close, whose sensitivity to the Force allowed them to feel something wrong in the spaces where Bane and Xana passed through. There were Republic agents pursuing lines of investigation that, followed far enough, would have led to uncomfortable places. There were individuals who found pieces of the puzzle, not enough to understand what they were looking at, but enough to be dangerous if they talked to the right people. These threats were addressed individually, quietly, in ways that left no pattern that could be analyzed after the fact, because there was no surviving observer with enough context to know what pattern to look for. This was the operational discipline that the Rule of Two demanded, and that Bane had built into Xana from the earliest days of her training. They were not at war. They were not trying to win battles. They were trying to remain invisible. And invisibility required a different kind of discipline than combat, a discipline that was in some ways harder because it demanded restraint, when restraint was the last thing the dark side was inclined to encourage. There was a man named Hetton. He is worth examining because he represents a particular kind of danger that the Rule of Two had to be constantly alert for. Hetton was not Force-sensitive in any meaningful way. He was wealthy, obsessive, and possessed of the particular kind of arrogance that accumulates in people who have spent their whole lives being able to buy solutions to problems. He had become interested in the Sith, not in the dark side as a practice or the Sith as a philosophy, but in the Sith as artifacts, as objects, as rare and collectible things that a man of sufficient resources could accumulate if he knew where to look and was willing to spend what it cost. He had assembled over the years a remarkable collection of Sith texts, among them things that Bane had been seeking and had not found through his own research channels. Ancient writings on Sith sorcery, and most particularly on the practice of essence transfer, the technique that had been haunting Bane's thinking for years. Essence transfer. The concept itself was older than the Rule of Two, older than the Brotherhood of Darkness, as old as the darkest experiments the ancient Sith had ever attempted. The idea was precisely what it sounded like. A Sith Lord of sufficient mastery, facing the end of their physical body, could attempt to move their consciousness, their essence, the actual thinking and feeling and knowing self that had existed in that body, into another body, a host, a vessel. The original body dies, and the new body becomes the Sith Lord's continuing existence. The mathematical implications of this for the Rule of Two were enormous. If a Sith Master could transfer their essence into their apprentice at the moment of death or defeat, then the Rule of Two's mechanism of succession would be subverted. the apprentice would become the master. Not because they had grown strong enough to destroy the master, but because the master had simply moved in. The apprentice's own personality and essence would be overwritten, consumed, replaced by the master's. The body that had been the apprentice would walk away carrying the master's mind and the master's knowledge and the master's ambitions, and then that master would eventually take a new apprentice and potentially do it again, and so on indefinitely. Immortality, not through the biological cheating that Darth Plagueis would later explore, but through continuous possession of a sequence of bodies. Bane was drawn to this concept with an intensity that was itself revealing. He believed in the rule of two. He had designed it. He had burned the old Sith order to the ground to implement it. But the rule of two was also designed to kill him. One master, one apprentice. The apprentice must one day destroy the master. He had designed his own death into the system, which required a certain philosophical acceptance of mortality that was easy to maintain in the abstract and became considerably more complicated as the years passed. And mortality became something you could actually feel rather than just conceptualize. The orbalisks had been removing some years from his natural lifespan, even while enhancing his abilities. He was not old by any galaxy standard measure, but he was closer to his physical limits than he had been at Ruusan. And the dark side's relationship with the aging body is not a gentle one. The dark side pours through a being, and it does not protect the vessel, it uses the vessel. Bane understood this. He also understood that understanding something and being at peace with it are not always the same. Hetton came to him, which was the important detail, not the other way around. Hetton had learned enough about the surviving Sith tradition to know that someone carrying that tradition existed somewhere in the galaxy, and he had made himself useful enough as a collector of Sith artifacts that the information about him had eventually filtered through channels to Bane's attention. The negotiation was brief. Hetton wanted status, acknowledgement, validation from an actual Sith of his significance as a collector and student. What Bane wanted from Hetton was access to those sorcery texts. The arrangement seemed, on the surface, straightforward. In practice, it was not, because Hetton, like most people who mistake the accumulation of information about power for the possession of power itself, had fundamentally misread the situation he was in. He thought he was negotiating with a peer. He was in a room with something that did not have peers. Bane took what he needed from Hetton in the way that the dark side takes what it needs from everything it encounters, completely and without sentiment. Hetton did not leave the encounter in any condition to discuss what he had agreed to or what he had given away. The sorcery texts were extraordinary. Bane spent weeks with them, reading with the focused attention he gave to anything that might constitute a genuine breakthrough in his understanding. What he found was both more and less than he had hoped. More, because the technical framework for essence transfer was far more developed than he had realized, with specific procedures and requirements laid out in detail that previous sources had only gestured at. Less, because the more he understood the technique, the more apparent it became that its successful execution required not just power, but a very specific kind of knowledge about the target host, a deep understanding of their force signature, their psychological architecture, the particular channels through which their consciousness was organized so that the transferring essence could find those channels and flow through them rather than colliding with them. You could not simply pour yourself into another person. You had to know precisely how that person was built on the inside. And the person you could most easily know in that way was the person you had been training for years, the apprentice. Always the apprentice. This was the paradox that Bane turned over for years. The rule of two demanded the apprentice destroy the master. Essence transfer offered a way for the master to survive that destruction by inhabiting the apprentice. But essence transfer required exactly the kind of deep mutual knowledge that a master and a long-term apprentice would have. And using it would destroy the rule of two's mechanism of succession, replacing growth with a kind of stagnation disguised as continuity. The same consciousness, the same mind, carrying the same knowledge and the same limitations, moving through body after body, while never actually developing, never actually becoming stronger, never actually fulfilling the forward momentum that the rule of two was designed to produce. He understood the temptation. He also understood the flaw. But understanding the flaw did not make the temptation less real. Music, Xana knew. This is the thing about training someone with exceptional intelligence and genuine force sensitivity. You cannot entirely hide from them. The master reveals things to the apprentice simply by being near them, by thinking near them, by the way the force carries the texture of a person's inner landscape to anyone sensitive enough to read it. Xana had been reading Bane's inner landscape for 20 years. She knew the contours of his philosophy better than any person alive. She had internalized them, built her own understanding of the dark side around them, incorporated them into the architecture of who she was. She also knew the places where the philosophy was under pressure, where the man diverged from the principle. She knew about essence transfer. Not because he had told her, but because she was paying the kind of attention that she had always paid, filing away observations and processing them over months and years, and arriving at conclusions that no single conversation or gesture had explicitly communicated, and she had a plan of her own. She had been building it for years in the same quiet, patient way that she built everything, in the spaces of training sessions and the silences between lessons and the long periods when Bane was absorbed in his research and she was nominally studying and was in practice preparing. She had taken an apprentice of her own. This was technically a violation of the rule of two in its most literal interpretation, which mandated exactly 2 Sith and no more. But she had not taken a full Sith apprentice. She had found a being with force potential, and had been working with them in ways that stayed below the threshold of what the rule would formally prohibit, in the gray area between genuine instruction and exploitation of a useful asset. The being was a girl, a Iktochi, with a powerful gift for force precognition, the ability to sense the future with a clarity that most precognitive beings only achieved in fragments. She went by the name Set, or Cognos, when Xana eventually formalized their relationship. But that formalization was still ahead. What Xana needed first was to complete the confrontation with Bane that had been building toward inevitability for longer than either of them had spoken aloud. The confrontation came on Ambria. This was not accidental. Ambria was the world where Bane had nearly died during the orbalisk removal, and it was the world where the dark side was concentrated enough that a significant force confrontation could be conducted without the energies bleeding out into the force in ways that Jedi on distant worlds might detect. Xana chose the location. She had thought about the choice carefully, which was itself characteristic. She had thought about everything carefully for her entire life. The location was tactical. The timing was tactical. Even the revelation that she was ready, the moment when she finally stepped out of the posture of student and into the posture of challenger, was tactical. She had been preparing this moment for years. She had made certain she was ready, not just in terms of raw power, which she was, but in terms of the specific kind of power that would be most effective against Bane specifically. His overwhelming force presence, his dark side endurance, his ferocity, and his physical power, and the decades of experience that made him genuinely dangerous. Even without the orbalisk enhancement he had given up, she was not fighting the general idea of a powerful Sith Lord. She was fighting Darth Bane, whom she knew more intimately than she knew anyone else alive. And she had designed her approach to this fight around that specific knowledge. He had suspected this was coming. Not on this day, not in this form, not exactly. But Bane had known since Ruusan that this confrontation was the destination toward which everything was moving. He had trained her to destroy him, not consciously, not as an explicit goal, but as a consequence of training her correctly, which meant training her to be stronger than he was. A master who trains their apprentice only to their own level has failed the rule of two. The succession requires the apprentice to exceed the master. He had done his job. He had done it well. The being across from him on the dark surface of Ambria was the product of his most sustained and careful work, the most thorough expression of what he understood about the dark side and how to cultivate it in another person. She was, in the most meaningful sense, his greatest achievement. The duel that followed was not like the duels Bane had fought at the Sith Academy or the battles he had survived as a soldier, or even the confrontations that had punctuated the years since Ruusan. Those duels had been between opponents who were trying to impose their will on each other from the outside, using force abilities and combat technique as external instruments. This was something else. Two beings who had spent 20 years in each other's force presence, who knew the texture of each other's darkness, the way most people know the sound of each other's voices, fighting not just with the force but through it, using their shared understanding of each other as both weapon and vulnerability simultaneously. Xana's sorcery reached into places that should have been defended but were not, because she had spent 20 years learning exactly where those places were. Bane's raw power found angles of attack that should have been obvious, but were not, because he had spent 20 years knowing how she thought and could anticipate the shapes of her defense before she constructed them. It was from the outside. If anyone had been outside to observe it, probably terrifying. From the inside, it was something more complicated. Bane felt, in the midst of it, the particular emotion that he had the most difficulty naming throughout his life. The emotion that was not pride and not love and not attachment in any sense the Jedi would have recognized, but was the Sith equivalent of all of those things compressed into a single experience. He was fighting his greatest work. He was being beaten by his greatest work. And in the dark side, there was something about that which did not feel like defeat. What happened at the end of the confrontation is the question that the galaxy never definitively answered. Xana won. That much is certain. The duel ended with Bane's body destroyed or incapacitated beyond recovery. The physical vessel that had carried Darth Bane from the Cortosis mines of Apatros to the Valley of the Dark Lords of Korriban, to the ruins of Ruusan, and through 20 more years of shaping the Sith into something the galaxy did not yet know existed, that vessel was finished. But whether Bane himself was finished is another question entirely, because in the moments before the end, he had attempted essence transfer. He had known for years that he might attempt it. He had debated with himself for years whether he should. He had understood the philosophical problems with it, the way it would undermine the rule of two's mechanism, the way it would prioritize his own continuation over the Order's forward momentum. And in the actual moment, with the end arriving faster than any amount of preparation could make entirely comfortable, the temptation had been exactly what he had always known it would be: overwhelming. Whether it worked is a question the Sith themselves could not definitively answer, and the galaxy certainly could not. Zannah walked away from Ambria as Darth Zannah, the Sith Master, the second link in the chain that Bane had forged. She took Cognos as her formal apprentice. She continued the tradition exactly as Bane had designed it. One master, one apprentice. The knowledge preserved and transmitted and built upon rather than diluted. What was behind her eyes? What inhabited the architecture of her consciousness in the years that followed? What memories and perspectives and fundamental qualities of selfhood persisted from her own life versus what might have arrived from somewhere else? This is not the kind of question that can be resolved from the outside. The Force does not announce its most intimate transactions. What was certain was the outcome. The chain continued. Music. Cognos was not Zannah. She could not have been, because the rule of two required each link in the chain to be distinct, the particular expression of this specific individual's relationship with the dark side, rather than a reproduction of the previous link. Cognos was an Iktochi, and Iktochi have a relationship with time that humans and most other species simply do not possess. Their precognitive ability is not a force power in the conventional sense, not something that requires training to access or effort to employ. It is woven into their neurology, a constant background awareness of the probability landscape that surrounds their decisions. They do not see the future in any simple, predictive sense. They see the shape of what is likely, the texture of where things are moving, the way certain choices close off certain possibilities and open others. In an ordinary Iktochi, this ability was a personal advantage that occasionally made them seem uncannily perceptive. In an Iktochi, who was also a Sith Lord of genuine power, it was something considerably more strategic. Cognos operated in the Force with an awareness of consequences that extended further than most Sith had managed to cultivate even through deliberate practice. She could feel the downstream effects of her actions, not as predictions, but as intuitions that were rarely wrong. She chose her own apprentice, continued the chain, and the chain continued through her as it had continued through Zannah, each link carrying everything the previous links had built and adding to it the specific thing that only this particular being could contribute. The years became decades. The decades became centuries. The Sith moved through the galaxy in the space between galactic attention, in the margins, in the anonymity that two people can maintain in a population of quadrillions. The Republic continued its long, slow drift through history, its institutions accumulating the weight of centuries in the way that institutions do, their original purposes gradually becoming less visible under layers of procedure and tradition, and the specific inertia that develops in any organization old enough to have forgotten what it was originally for. The Jedi Order continued its guardianship, vigilant against the threats they knew about, and the ones they could sense in the Force, and genuinely blind to the specific threat that Bane had designed to be invisible to them. They had convinced themselves at Ruzan that the Sith were gone. They had 1,000 years of subsequent history that seemed to confirm this conviction. They looked for armies of dark side warriors and found none. They looked for Sith empires and found none. They did not know how to look for two people who were not doing anything that looked like what the Sith were supposed to do. This was Bane's deepest insight. The Jedi could only fight what they could see, and what they could see was shaped by what they expected. They expected Sith Lords to gather power openly, to build organizations, to declare themselves, to come into conflict with the Republic in ways that were legible as conflict. They were not prepared for Sith Lords who were, generation after generation, quietly studying and learning and accumulating, not power in any conventional sense, but understanding. Understanding of the Republic's weaknesses, understanding of the Jedi Order's limitations, understanding of the specific pressure points in galactic politics and economics and culture that, if engaged at precisely the right moment with precisely the right technique, would cause the whole magnificent edifice to begin collapsing under its own weight without anyone ever being able to identify where the collapse had started. This is what the rule of two was actually building. Not just stronger Sith, smarter Sith, patient Sith. Sith who understood that their enemy was not the Republic in any immediate political sense, but the idea of the Republic. The belief that power should be distributed and accountable and constrained by law, and that the most effective weapon against an idea is not force but corruption. The slow replacement of the real thing with a simulacrum that maintains all the forms while hollowing out all the substance. Generation by generation, each master and apprentice added to the body of knowledge, refined the strategy, brought the long, patient plan a step closer to executable. Some generations were defined by consolidation, deepening the philosophical foundation, adding to the archive of Sith knowledge, refining the operational methodology that kept them invisible. Other generations took more active roles in galactic events, inserting themselves into specific situations where their particular abilities could advance the long-term goal by accelerating processes that were already moving in useful direction. A political crisis nudged in one direction rather than another. An economic disruption managed to increase the Republic's institutional dysfunction rather than being resolved. A promising individual guided toward a position of influence where their particular weaknesses could be cultivated into leverage. None of this looked like Sith activity from the outside. It looked like ordinary galactic history, the messy accretion of events that produces the present from the past without any single author or any visible design. Music. Darth Plagueis arrived in this lineage as a being of exceptional intelligence, carrying the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of Sith heritage and adding to it a scientific methodology that the earlier generation had not quite managed to develop. Plagueis was a moon, with the calculating mathematical intelligence that the moon species applied to everything, and he turned that intelligence toward the Force with a relentlessness that produced results no previous Sith had achieved. His particular obsession was life itself, not in the abstract philosophical sense in which earlier Sith had sometimes contemplated existence, but in the specific technical sense of understanding how the Force created and sustained and ended life, and whether the mechanisms of that process could be understood well enough to be controlled. He worked in secret laboratories, on experiments that the Jedi would have considered the most profound desecration of the Force's nature imaginable. He was not interested in the Jedi's opinion of his work. He was interested in results. What Plagueis was building toward was a synthesis of Bane's original vision and something new. Bane had wanted the Sith to destroy the Republic and replace it with a galaxy ordered by strength. Plagueis wanted that too. But he also wanted something more personal, which was the end of death itself, at least for himself, and whatever Sith came after him who were worth preserving. The Rule of Two's mechanism of succession, which Bane had accepted and even celebrated as the engine of Sith improvement, was to Plagueis a limitation that the Sith had been tolerating out of philosophical loyalty to a tradition rather than pragmatic recognition of what was actually optimal. If the Sith could achieve genuine immortality, actual biological continuity, rather than the crude essence transfer that Bane had contemplated, then the Rule of Two's succession mechanism could be replaced with something more efficient. Not a return to the old Brotherhood model of many Sith, just two genuinely immortal Sith, accumulating power and knowledge without the interruption of succession, improving without the catastrophic discontinuity of one master's death, and the scramble to ensure the apprentice had internalized everything necessary before that death occurred. He found his apprentice in a young human named Palpatine from the world of Naboo. Palpatine was not the most naturally powerful Force user Plagueis could have chosen. He was something more interesting than powerful. He was exceptional in the qualities that mattered most for what Plagueis was building and what Bane had ultimately designed the entire 1,000-year project to produce. He was brilliant. He was patient in a way that most humans never managed to be. He was socially gifted to a degree that was almost itself a force power, the ability to walk into a room and within minutes understand exactly what every person in that room wanted and feared, and how those wants and fears could be engaged to produce outcomes of his own choosing. And he was ruthless in the specific way that the dark side required. Not the crude ruthlessness of a being who simply does not care about consequences, but the precise ruthlessness of a being who has thought carefully about consequences and decided that the ones involving harm to others are acceptable costs of the outcomes they are pursuing. He was, in short, exactly what 1,000 years of careful, selective development of Sith philosophy had been designed to produce. Palpatine took the Sith name Darth Sidious, and Darth Sidious began the final act of the plan that Darth Bane had designed in the Valley of the Dark Lords of Korriban a millennium before. He moved into the Republic's political institutions not as a conqueror but as a participant. As a senator from Naboo, earnest and capable and principled in appearance, exactly the kind of politician that a republic supposedly governed by democratic ideals should celebrate and elevate. He built relationships. He accumulated favors. He learned the architecture of the Senate's corruption and the Jedi Order's blind spots with the patience of a being who had been trained to think in decades rather than election cycles. He was not in a hurry. The 1,000 years of Sith patience that Bane had established as the fundamental operating principle of the dynasty was in his blood, and in his training, and in the specific quality of his ambition, which was not feverish or urgent, but cold and long and absolutely certain of its eventual success. He took his own apprentice in Darth Maul, a being of devastating physical power and absolute commitment to the Sith cause, and began the final phase. The Trade Federation, the blockade of Naboo, the manufactured crisis that put Palpatine himself in the position to propose the solution, which was his elevation to Supreme Chancellor, the position from which everything else followed. he had manufactured the crisis that made his own rise feel like a democratic choice. The Senate thought they were selecting a leader capable of handling a difficult situation. They were handing the keys of the Republic to the man who had created the difficult situation for exactly this purpose. Think about the patience required to plan that, to sit in the Senate for years, performing honesty and capability and principled concern for the Republic's well-being, while privately engineering the exact circumstances that would make your elevation to its highest office seem not just acceptable but necessary. This was Bane's patience. This was 1,000 years of Sith philosophy expressed in the political career of one extraordinary man who had been trained to carry it. The Clone Wars were the culmination. A war that Sidious had designed from both sides simultaneously because he was controlling both sides simultaneously. The separatist movement through the Sith apprentice he had cultivated among Count Dooku, and the Republic through his position as Supreme Chancellor. Two armies, funded and equipped and led by the same intelligence, operating under two different faces, fighting a war that was designed not to be won in any conventional sense, but to exhaust and traumatize the Republic's institutions so thoroughly that when Sidious finally revealed himself and declared the Empire, the Senate would be too broken and too frightened and too grateful for the promise of order to object effectively. And the Jedi, who had spent the entire war fighting on behalf of a Republic that was already being dismantled around them, would be caught completely off guard by the moment when the troops they had been fighting alongside turned on them. Order 66 was the culmination of every lesson the Sith had ever learned about patience, about hiding, about building things in secret over long periods of time. The clone army had been commissioned years before anyone understood why. The inhibitor chips had been installed in every trooper. The Order had been waiting for the moment when Sidious chose to deliver it. And when he did, the Jedi, who had been the galaxy's guardians for 1,000 years, and who had spent those years watching for Sith threats, and had never found two people in a room because two people in a room do not look like a threat, the Jedi fell in hours. The Republic became the Empire. The Senate, that had been the Republic's voice, was kept for cosmetic purposes, reduced to applauding its own irrelevance. Palpatine, now Emperor Palpatine, ruled openly as what he had always been, the most powerful dark side user in the galaxy, no longer concealed by any pretense of democratic participation. The mask was off. The work was done. And in the moment of his declaration, in the thunderous approval of the Senate that did not yet understand what it was approving, the echo of Darth Bane was present as surely as it had ever been. This was the seed planted in the Valley of the Dark Lords. This was what 1,000 years of one master and one apprentice had been building toward. Not just the defeat of the Republic, the replacement of it. Root and branch. Darth Vader arrived as the final piece of the succession Bane had designed. The apprentice to the most powerful Sith master the Rule of Two had ever produced. Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one. The being whose connection to the Force was so profound that even the Jedi had recognized it as something outside their categories, turned by grief and loss, and the specific vulnerability of a man who loved too much and feared that love's loss more than he feared the dark side. Vader was not chosen because he was the strongest available. He was chosen because Sidious understood, with the acute psychological intelligence that 1,000 years of Sith philosophy had been distilling, that the strongest potential dark side user in the galaxy had a weakness that could be exploited, and that exploiting it would produce a weapon of unparalleled destructive capability. And, for a generation, it did. The Empire held. The Jedi were gone. The Sith ruled. But the rule of two had always contained within itself the mechanism of its own transformation. One master, one apprentice. The apprentice craves the master's power. Vader had served for a generation, and the craving had not diminished. It had simply been redirected, channeled into loyal service by the overwhelming power of Sidious, and the specific psychological configuration of a man who blamed himself for the losses that had brought him to the dark side. Vader served and suffered and served, carrying in his reconstructed body the same dark fire that had carried Dessel through the cortosis mines of Apatros, the same refusal to accept what the universe was trying to do to him, the same compressed fury, looking for a target. The target eventually revealed itself not as the Jedi or the rebels, or any of the enemies the Empire fought in the open. It revealed itself on the Death Star above Endor, in the form of a young man with his father's eyes, in the moment when Vader looked at his son being destroyed by the Emperor and felt something that the rule of two had never managed to eliminate from any of its successors. The thing that Bane himself had felt in the Valley of the Dark Lords, when he had understood, for the first time, what he was and what he wanted, and what he was willing to do. Attachment to something beyond the self. Love in the specific form that the Sith could never quite train out of beings who had possessed it before the dark side found them. Vader threw the Emperor into the shaft. The Emperor died. The chain was broken. Or was it? Because what Bane had actually designed, at the deepest level, was not the Empire specifically. He had designed a proof, a demonstration that his core principle was correct, that one master and one apprentice, operating patiently and invisibly across a sufficient span of time, could accomplish what 1,000 Sith Lords fighting openly had never managed. He had proven that the dark side of the Force, properly organized, properly focused, properly directed by a single sufficiently powerful will through a single sufficiently chosen vessel, generation after generation after generation, could reshape any civilization, dissolve any institution, subvert any resistance. The Empire was just one expression of that proof. The methodology itself, the rule of two, the Sith dynasty that had begun in the ruins of a single battle on a forested world at the edge of the Outer Rim, the patience, the invisibility, the careful transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next without dilution and without distraction. That methodology was the real legacy. A man from the cortosis mines of Apatros, who had never had any reason to believe he would become anything at all, had reached across 1,000 years and reshaped the galaxy, not with armies, not with force lightning or lightsaber duels or the dramatic confrontations of the kind that history tends to remember and celebrate, with an idea, simple, terrible, and elegant, beyond anything the Jedi had ever conceived of. Two, always two, never more, never less. One to embody the power and one to crave it, and in the craving to grow, and in the growing to eventually destroy the one they had learned from, and in that destruction to become the next beginning, the next link in the chain, the next dark flame passed from hand to hand across the centuries, burning brighter with each transmission, patient and invisible, and absolutely, completely, irrevocably certain of its eventual destination. Darth Bane looked at the galaxy from the Valley of the Dark Lords and knew exactly how it would end. He planted the seed. He chose the first of the gardeners. And then he let time do what time does to things that are properly planted. He let it grow,